technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. First half hour, we're going to spend some time looking at some of the issues in the news. Press conference was held yesterday there on the Capitol steps. We'll talk about that. Revisiting this whole issue of the shooting in Minnesota from a different perspective, and maybe even getting into a little bit more about transgenderism, but also do want to talk about education, and a very good and kind of an interestingly titled piece, which says airline food and academic standards. But we'll get to that in just a few minutes, because later this hour we're going to have our good friend Chad Hufford. We know him from Veritas Wealth Management, but also he's the author of the book Forging Financial Freedom. Going to talk about how to increase your ability to give to others, whether it's to your church, whether it's to missions, to Christian organizations, whatever that might be. That's something we've talked about in the past with Raymond Harris and his book Enduring Wealth. We've talked about it with Randy Alcorn, Money, Possessions, and Eternity. But some of these things, some of these platforms and various kinds of instruments that were available to high net worth people now are available to many of us in the middle class. So we're going to talk about that with him. And the next hour, we're going to get into the book Ownership, which is by Dr. Sean McGever. It gets us into the issue of slavery and also the evangelical legacy of slavery with Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and George Whitefield. So I think you'll appreciate that in terms of history, but also gets us back into, of course, as we've talked about before, one of the dark chapters in American history. So a lot to cover. If we don't get to all of it today, we have some really great guests tomorrow, and of course then we have our Friday weekend edition, so there will be some opportunities. I do just want to mention in passing the fact that yesterday there was a press conference in which a group of women who were the individuals who were abused and were taken advantage of by Jeffrey Epstein and the like, and they plan to release their own list of names of individuals who were known to be part of Jeffrey Epstein's social circle. I won't spend a lot of time on that other than to recognize that there is legislation being considered as to whether or not that would be forcing the Justice Department to do what the Justice Department should have done in the first place, and that is to force the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to release all the documents. And if you want to think about what this may be one of the worst PR disasters in the Trump administration, let's give credit to Donald Trump and his administration. They haven't had too many PR disasters. This one is one of those, and I would love to know someday the behind-the-scenes story from a variety of individuals, whether it's Kash Patel or a variety, Dan Bongino, Pam Bondi, maybe some other people, to what is going on there. But nevertheless, I did want to mention that as something that's been in the news, and we will come back to it when we know more, because quite frankly, most of us don't know very much. But if they start releasing names, we certainly want to be talking about that on Point of View. But my first article is entitled Wicked Online. Jeffrey Blahar is an individual that writes a once-a-week column, and he called this the 52nd performance of the Carnival of Fools. And I've been following him over time because oftentimes he, more than others, sees the humor or the irony or the fallacy of some of the things happening in the political realm. And he said this last year, I confess, has been quite the education, a miseducation, he says, in part because we probably learned nothing good, but he's learned a little bit more about some of the problems. And so he spends a little bit of time talking about the fact that something wicked this way comes. We've heard that before, but that's the title of his piece. Speaking of things I wish I were allowed to look away from, I did not want to write about the shooting in Minneapolis last week. I still don't want to address the specifics in any way, if for no other reason than I believe that the sorts of people who commit these acts dream of laments like that being written, the promise of infamy, and that's certainly one of the reasons why we don't mention the names. Goes on and gets into some other issues, but finally said, I really can only offer this. The starting point here is mental illness. But the ending point is the online sump into which mental illness now collects itself like a malarial pool, cross-fertilizing into every more virulent strains of social disease. Whether you like him or not, I do love his wordcraft, and that's just one good example of that. He says our modern world is a breeding nihilistic evil, even as it lets age-old demons loose. The killers apparently announced or renounced transgender identity as relevant, but only as a symptom of a much broader and darker underlying problem affecting America. Goes on then to talk about other things like Gavin Newsom and the rest, but I thought it was poignant that he, again, reminds us that these ideas don't happen in a vacuum. There are many people that will argue, well, it's because we have so many guns. Well, I have been in situations, surrounded by rooms, surrounded by ranges, even sometimes in schools where there are more guns than people, and I never really felt unsafe. So it isn't necessarily the guns. And some people say, well, it's the violent images we see on TV. Well, those violent images existed back in the 1950s and 60s. We didn't have shootings. But Columbine kind of switched everything, and social media switched something. And as a result, we're seeing that level today. The one thing I would point out is there are at least a few people that have actually done the research and remind us that when people say the fact that this particular shooter was transgender is irrelevant, it certainly goes against some of the evidence. Let me quote from Matt Vespa, who I quote sometimes. He points out, for example, a Western journal, which I have sometimes quote, did an analysis showing that since 2020, so that's been the last 5 years, 40% of mass shooters or would-be mass shooters have been identified as transgender, or in some cases were suspected of being such since some of them were shot by the police. Let me quote somebody else, Josh Manning. He says, once you cut through the gang violence, revenge, romance gone bad noise, Grok and GPT both have an estimate, and that's where they again come up with this 40% of school shooters or would-be shooters since 2020 have been trans or suspected trans. Doesn't mean that all individuals that are dealing with gender dysphoria are going to be violent. Doesn't even mean those individuals that have gone through some kind of transition and are trans will. But I think it does illustrate that this issue that we are constantly told by the legacy media is irrelevant maybe isn't as irrelevant as we might think. It's one of the reasons why we from time to time cover these issues, even at the risk of being called transphobic or something else. The bottom line is we do notice something that's not right. And as a result, it's worth a conversation, and it's certainly worth a little bit of information in that regard. First article there is by Jeffrey Blahar. When we come back, I want to change the topic. Everybody's in school now, but a very good piece by Jonathan Butcher. I love this. Airplane food and academic standards. Now stay with me because he's got a really good point. Really takes us back to this issue of the importance of classical education. So we'll get into that. All that coming up right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
David Brooks writes in the New York Times about America's new segregation. He isn't talking about racial segregation, but instead is focusing on class segregation. Essentially, we're talking about self-segregation. He quotes from the book Diminished Democracy, which observed that Americans used to join cross-class community organizations like the Rotary or the Elks Clubs, but gradually highly educated people left them for professional organizations filled with others more like themselves. Dan McLaughlin agrees with David Brooks, but then adds another important reason. First, he agrees with him and points to the veterans of foreign wars, which crossed class lines because military service was a common experience. But that began to change during the Vietnam War, when college deferments meant that college-going young men could avoid the draft. Second, Dan McLaughlin points to another reason Brooks did not mention: ideology. He says progressive lawsuits, pressure campaigns, and marches through the institutions had a lot to do with killing cross-class institutions, especially those that once served men. The Boy Scouts are Exhibit A of this dynamic. Dads and sons camping in the woods and learning knots and archery and the like was once an activity where it didn't matter if your dad was a surgeon or a bricklayer. When the Boy Scouts were formed, they represented so much of what was good about America. Less than a century later, they went from being one of the most admired groups to one of the most vilified groups. Our polarized political world is due to many factors, but an important one is self-segregation that is taking place in society. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, while school is in session, I thought it would be good to talk about some other educational issues. Might just let you know that we did talk just recently about what's called the Southern Surge. That will be a commentary coming out next week. But this particular one, I might turn it into a commentary as well. Airplane Food and Academic Standards, written by Jonathan Butcher, who is the acting director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And interestingly enough, he says, look, no one likes airplane food, which almost always invariably means small portions, limited options, and the unavoidable presence of chicken. Despite bland offerings, passengers are usually just hungry enough or just bored enough to eat it anyway. In K through 12, primary and secondary schools in the United States, academic standards are the equivalent of airline food. He talks about the fact that, of course, we set those standards, but the standards are so broad, lacking in details, that like airline passengers, teachers and students are captive audience with very few alternatives. He says now the goals in some U.S. states differ strikingly from one another in a way that highlights the strong undercurrent of radical racial and gender ideology in some of the state school systems. He gives you some examples. For example, the academic standards for social studies and ethnic studies in California and Minnesota stand in stark contrast to the social studies standards in Louisiana and South Dakota, something he highlights in a piece that he's written on reclaiming classical education. For example, California even assigns students to read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, a highly cynical take on American history that has been debunked by historians, including those on the left of the ideological divide. Those of you watching online, you can see I'm holding up my copy of the Howard Zinn book, A People's History of the United States. You might say, well, why do I have that on my bookshelf? Because I want to warn people about how awful and pernicious it is. And we have done a program on that as well. Actually, I've done some commentaries on it, but we've done a whole set of programs. And this is the book I'm holding up right now by Mary Grabar, Debunking Howard Zinn. By the way, I looked it up. This interview was done 6 years ago, so maybe we need to come back to it again. I did a commentary earlier this year that you can find as well. So type in Howard Zinn or something like that. People's particular situation, which you might take on there, the People's History of the United States, whatever it might be, and you can find it. And he says, conversely, the standards in Louisiana and South Dakota celebrate America's commitment to freedom and representative political systems, even while acknowledging that no nation is perfect. He then goes from there to say, maybe we can learn some things from classical education. And he reminds us that classical schools teach Latin and Greek to students so they can read original sources in their original languages. These schools base their teachings on the great books, works by the likes of Shakespeare and Homer and Plato, books containing the very concepts on which the edifices of Americans' culture of freedom and liberty rest. These schools also typically are low-tech, de-emphasizing the use of laptops and cell phones. Instead, they focus on etiquette, something sorely lacking both in academia and politics today. They also teach logic, and critical thinking. We've talked about that before on this program. And so anyway, the argument he makes is schools are right now, in many cases, serving the equivalent of airline food, and they're starving their students. For the sake of students and the health of education, lawmakers in the U.S. and around the globe should make use of what classical education has to teach each of us. Tomorrow, I'm going to get into another aspect because there are some people warning, including a very good piece by a person that served in the Clinton administration about the number of young people that are not going back to school. Now, in some cases, they're not going back to school because they just sort of learned that during the pandemic, they didn't have to go to school. There are others that are not going to school because they maybe their parents said, I think I can do a better job homeschooling than we can by sending you to the public schools. So there's a lot of reasons. We'll get into that tomorrow, but it's just an illustration, again, that what used to be the assumption that every student would be in school is sometimes changing rather dramatically. And Jonathan Butcher reminds us that if we want to improve the public schools, maybe we could learn a few lessons from how we used to do schooling in the past in this country, and even how we do it today in some of these classical Christian schools. But just one other piece I wanted to get to real quickly, and that is a very good and well-written piece by Brooke Brandingen. And she is very young, just 5 years ago, graduated from high school. So in some respects, she's looking at what has happened to her own generation. And she says, anyone who has watched transgenderism ruin friends' lives knows how evil it is. She says, I know transgenderism is fake because I know what the before looks like. When we talk about transgenderism, we often don't talk about the before, but she wants to. She said, I had lots of friends when I was 14 who have since gone on to transition over the course of the intervening 10 years. I didn't know it at the time, but I was surrounded by the before of transgenderism. The consequences of its life-altering effects were still in the process of being kicked down the road. At that time, she was a Christian, but she points out that she was sort of detached, wasn't really taking it as seriously as that. She has since then. But now she says, I graduated from high school 5 years ago. Most of the people I knew back then are no longer with me. Not because they died, but because they have fallen victim to the LGBT movement. Most of the friends I made at age 14 now identify as either transgender or non-binary. They exist in a nebulous realm of non-gender, denying their biological realities in favor of victimhood status. I knew these kids, The boys were rambunctious and liked to fight and make silly jokes. The girls were amicable and artistic. But she noticed two things that happened. A lot of my friends began drinking and smoking weed, and they began diagnosing themselves with mental health problems at the same time that they came out with some version of LGBTQIA. She says, I know transgenderism is fake because I know what the before looks like. I know my friends were born in the right bodies, that God made no mistakes with them. They were nerdy kids who like video games and art instead of football and shopping. But she points out that these discrepancies in interests and personalities led them to feel like outcasts, and eventually, of course, they found their home, as she points out, in the LGBTQ community. So she says, I don't like to talk about the after my friends told me God didn't exist, after there were drugs and surgeries and mental health crisis, after I was totally cut out of their lives of people I grew up with because I embraced my Christian faith and leaned into conservatism. She liked the before, and she doesn't like the after. I like to think about the before. I like to think if my friends had been protected from some of these predatory ideologues, they wouldn't have been pulled into this group. I remember the before. It was beautiful. Let's make sure no more kids have to grow up in the after. Pretty powerful from somebody who has seen what happened to her own friends. And it certainly reminds me of the tweet that I saw put out this week by J.K. Rowling. How many are Harry Potter fans? I see those hands. Well, again, she has taken all the slings and arrows from taking some stands. And once again, she says, once again, I find myself having individuals saying that they don't want to be involved when the HBO reboot of Harry Potter because of my stance. So she says, here's what they are. It's my belief that women and girls should have their own public changing rooms and bathrooms. It's my belief that women should refrain from female-only rape crisis centers. Should retain, I should say. Men don't belong in women's sports. Female prisoners shouldn't be incarcerated with violent men and male sex offenders. That women should remain a protected class in law because they have sex-specific needs and issues. That language should reflect reality rather than ideological jargon, especially in a medical context. That women shouldn't be harassed, persecuted, or fired for refusing to pretend humans can change their sex. That women should not be threatened with violence and rape when they assert their rights. That freedom of speech and belief are essential to a pluralistic democratic society, which is becoming harder and harder in the country she lives in, the UK. That troubled minors, especially those who are gay, autistic, and trauma experienced, should be given mental health support instead of reversible surgeries and drug treatments on non-existent evidence of benefit. And she goes through a very long list that is longer than I can read. But I think, again, it was an illustration that once you come out with some common sense, you really get attacked. But she was bold enough to make her list. I read most of it. You can go out and find it for yourself. And it's a reminder once again that we're all about common sense. And let's give some appreciation for J.K. Rowling for speaking up and standing up for common sense. We'll be back with more right after this.
Picture someone in your life, if you can, who needs the truth. Have you ever wished that you could point that person to resources that would help them? Maybe they're buying into mainstream media lies, and you wish you could easily share information providing a more full picture. Or maybe they're questioning their faith. They need devotionals and testimonies, resources they identify with. Maybe they're navigating parenting in this modern era. They need insight on handling new technology and mental health crises and everything in between. When you support Point of View, you provide resources just like these to people who need the truth. The best way to support Point of View is by joining the Truth Team. I invite you to learn more about the Truth Team by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can learn by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. The Truth Team, pointofview.net. and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we certainly like to talk about from time to time is the importance of giving to the Lord's work. And I'm just thinking about somebody that we had in studio years ago, David Green, the founder of Hobby Lobby. And we talked about his book, Giving It All Away and Getting It Back, back again. And certainly the philanthropy that the Green family have been involved with. I'll hold up another book here. This is one by our good friend Raymond Harris, been in the studio before. We've talked about enduring wealth and his desire to certainly use the giving that God has put in his hand to give in to actually advance the kingdom. And in the past, of course, we had our good friend Randy Alcorn on. I'll hold up his book here, Money, Possessions, and Eternity, and the Treasure Principle. And so I thought it would be helpful if, again, we might be able to encourage you to do so, but also to do it in a way that might provide for many of you an opportunity that you may not know exists. And that is that there are ways which people that have high net worth can use some of the various techniques and strategies to increase their ability to give to the Lord's work. And we found out from our good friend Chad Hufford that there are now some changes that would make that available to you as well. Now, I recognize trying to explain that in a half an hour is not going to work very well, so we actually have already sent out an email that has a link to a number of times, and you just have to sign up for one of the three, in which you could say, I'd like to go to a Zoom call either in September, October, or November. These are at different times. So again, it should fit into your schedule. And so we have got put on the website, pointofview.net, information about that. Go to the right-hand corner. It says webinar registration. You'll see a big V there. Or if you receive an email, which we just sent out a couple of minutes ago, that would be enough. But again, if you're not familiar, Chad Hufford, I'll hold up his book here, which again is Forging Financial Freedom. He lives in Anchorage, Alaska, grew up in the financial industry. He's one of the top-ranked financial planners, Dave Ramsey Smart Investor, and of course the founder of Veritas Wealth Management. And Chad, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, as always, it is a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's first of all just talk about the value of giving to the Lord's work. I know that you are encouraging all the people that have been your clients over the years to consider what they might give to the Lord's work, and especially those that have access to some of these strategies have been able to make a greater impact, haven't they?
They have, and I think, one of the number one ingredients to the financial independence is more of a mindset of contentment than any numerical formula. I mean, you and I both know people, Kerby, who have millions or tens of millions of dollars who still live in scarcity and lack and fear and anxiety around their finances. And then we know people who are missionaries that have barely two quarters to rub together and feel content. And obviously those are two extremes, but for the average individual, contentment is the thief of joy and freedom, a lack of contentment is the thief of joy and freedom. And people who are content, it's easier to live within your means. It's easier to feel as if you have enough. You have the focus more on what's already in your life, the blessings that you've already received, rather than what everybody else has that you think is missing. And I think, so number one, contentment is absolutely essential to experiencing freedom in your finances. And number two, I think one of the best ways to grow that muscle of contentment is through generosity. Content people are almost exclusively generous, and generous people are very often very content. So I don't know how to separate those. So let's just lump them together and say one of the best ways to live content is to live generously.
I've been around many Christians over the years, Chad, that have said, I just wish I could give more. And that's when I stumbled upon this idea that these ideas of donor-advised funds and qualified charitable distributions, which are big words and big phrases, which we think, only rich people can take advantage of, and that has been true, that seems to be more available to a lot of our Point of View listeners. Can you tell us more?
Absolutely. And I think you're correct in these words and acronyms that get thrown around. I think the tendency is that's not for me. That's not a tool I can use. And I fully understand that people that are generous in the Lord's work, people that are even generous with Point of View. I mean, they're giving for a lot of reasons. They're giving because it's commanded by God. They're giving because they feel a sense of purpose. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. But if you can get some tax relief in that giving, that just adds extra blessing to giving to the Lord's work. That's not why we give, but it's an extra benefit. And I think a lot of times people miss out on that benefit simply because they don't know what is out there, or they're just not intentional about their giving. So with both donor-advised funds and qualified charitable distributions, there's a wide range of people who can benefit from each of those, or maybe even both of those. It's not just for the wealthy or the 1%. These are tools that everyday people can use to get an extra tax benefit from the money that they're already giving.
I might just mention, too, that we'll talk about some of these quickly, but there is a value in going to the Zoom sign-up. There's one for September 9th, one for October 15th, one for November 6th at different times, and so people can go to the website or check on the email to do that. But I found over the years, and I'll confess that I do tend to watch a fair number of financial YouTube videos, one because I'm personally interested somewhat, but also because I want to try to bring to the table some of the conversations that we really feel that we need to have at a time when we've had a pandemic, a lockdown, inflation, now questions about the Federal Reserve. Matter of fact, that's one of the Future Outlook magazines coming out. And so it's sometimes much easier on a Zoom call to see the graphs, the charts, and the information than it is to pick all that up from the radio. But what you're talking about here is everything from how people could maybe save on their taxes, how they could figure out how to maybe invest in some funds that would help grow those, even the idea of legacy planning. I know many of us want to think about not only what we can do, but what we can pass on to our children, or even legacy we can pass on to our church or Christian organization. So you're going to be covering all of that, aren't you?
We will. Yeah. And again, the focus is going to be on two particular areas, qualified charitable contributions or qualified charitable donations, and also donor-advised funds. And I can get into some of the bullet points on those in just a moment if you want, Kerby. But the donor-advised funds, especially, I think there's an intimidation around that. It doesn't have to be as complex as people make it, and it is something everybody can use. The qualified charitable donations, that is strictly for people who are over age 70 and a half. Mm-hmm. We can get into some of those nuances here in just a moment, but again, these are for wealthy folks, but they're also for your regular middle class folks that are just consistently giving, and the opportunity to get a little bit more of a tax break from what they're already doing.
Let me just mention, as we're coming to a break in just a minute, that first one is a week from yesterday. So, again, September 9th. Then there'll be one October 15th and one November 6th. So you don't have to attend all of them. Matter of fact, I think within an hour, you'll probably get what you need. And, of course, there's no obligation. But, again, for some people, it might say, well, what do you think is going to be covered? Well, I'm going to be one of those individuals, and one of our other staff will be there on the Zoom as well. So we're going to just sit with you and learn from an expert in that regard. But what we really want you to do is consider what you might want to do to bless other ministries. And I think starting, as I've always said, with your church. Number two, as I've said before, if you are listening on a radio station that carries point of view, I hope you might consider what you might do to support that radio station. And over these last few years, I've tried to travel to various places around the country where they maybe are doing some kind of fundraising to speak on their behalf. And certainly if you would want to support missions work or even point of view, those are some things that we really encourage you to do. Just before we go to the break, though, since we are going to, when we come back, talk about some of these strategies, if you want to have the full strategy, I will hold up this book because Chad's done very well in putting together many of his ideas about forging financial freedom. And really, the key to that is to have a game plan. You wouldn't build a house without a blueprint. You wouldn't begin to build a legacy without a financial blueprint. You wouldn't even begin to try to figure out where you are going to try to take the resources that God has placed in your hand and advance the kingdom without a blueprint. So I think that book will be very helpful to you. But let's take a break. For those of you that receive an email, I would encourage you to check the email. I just checked mine, and here it is. And it talks about two of those strategies about donor-advised funds and qualified charitable distributions. And even though that seems like something that's beyond your pay grade, I think you'll find out, especially if you go to the seminar, that these are some things some of us can do as well. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Chad Hufford right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Chad Hufford with us for a few more minutes. Let me just mention again, if you go to the website, pointofview.net, right-hand column, you'll see this big V for Veritas, Smart Giving Made Simple. There's a place where you can put your name, first, last name, email, and then click on the time you would want to attend, hit register. Simple as that. I've already done it, and I would encourage you to do that as well. Those of you taking some notes, you might, first of all, type or write down DAF. That's Donor Advised Funds. Chad, can you explain what those are?
Absolutely. It's almost like setting up a foundation, but much more simplistic. And you mentioned legacy planning. It allows donor-advised funds is something you can set up that can be part of your estate. And essentially what it is you take a lump sum and you gift it in a given tax year. So let's say you give it in 2025 into this fund. That fund can be invested. The fund can grow in and of itself. you've kind of relinquished your ownership of that. You relinquish your ownership of that money, and it is given in that year, but it's not necessarily distributed in that year. So even though you might be giving a lump sum into this fund, you still have a lot of flexibility with how that money is distributed. So it doesn't take away the flexibility or the even the spontaneity of giving that a lot of people enjoy. So let me just give you an example of somebody who, let's say, married couple, and they're giving $15,000 a year or something like that to various charities, and they have a household standard deduction of $31,500, and they don't itemize. They've got mortgage almost paid off, not a lot of deductions. So they take the standard deduction every single year. So they're not getting any tax break from their giving. They give $15,000 a year. Well, let's pretend that same couple took that and accelerated that and put a $60,000 donation into their donor advised fund, which again are very simple to set up, very straightforward. Well, now they have a $60,000 donation in that given tax year, and $28,500 can be written off their taxes in addition to their standard deduction. So rather than having that giving being lost in the standard deduction every single year, they put that 4 years of giving essentially in a donor advised fund, one-time gift into that fund, get a substantial tax break in that given year, but they can still give that, they can distribute, let me change my vernacular, they can distribute that over those 4 years. They don't have to distribute it all at once. And, you can be at a luncheon for a nonprofit and be like, oh, this is a great cause, I want to give to these guys. You can do that directly from your donor advised fund, even if that money, you wrote the check 2 years ago.
Yes.
You can distribute in the moment. You can distribute spontaneously. So it allows a tremendous amount of flexibility, but to maximize the tax benefit of your giving. That's just one example. Another example would be maybe somebody who has, a sale of a property, of a large capital gain, or you have a stock or a mutual fund in a non-qualified or after-tax account, a non-retirement account, and you have a lot of gains. You can offset those gains or even give stock directly into a donor-advised fund. Let's say you own a stock that's been shooting the lights out recently and it's becoming too large of a portion of your portfolio, but to rebalance would create a huge tax consequence.
Right.
Who have given that share of that, or some shares of that stock into their donor advised fund, and then they replace that inside their portfolio with cash that can be more broadly diversified. And once that stock is inside the donor advised fund, they can diversify that as well without any tax consequence. So it's just a really powerful tool that regular everyday people can use with a little bit of planning and intentionality.
And the good news is that in the past, that was something they said, well, it would only be for really high net worth individuals. And some people might say, well, you're still using numbers that I can't relate to. But given the fact that the cost or the price of our houses has doubled over the last 10 years, and even if you've had any kind of investment, and it could be an IRA or 401k or whatever, there are all sorts of capital gains issues. And anyway, you'll obviously take us through that. And of course, the other one I mentioned just briefly is again for qualified charitable deductions and distributions, which again are going to affect our older listeners. But the goal here is really just to try to educate people, because their tax savings, there's still flexibility, and again, legacy. I want to think not only about the legacy I want to leave to my children and grandchildren, but the legacy I want to live and leave to some of these churches and Christian organizations that I've been involved in, and that's something else you're going to be talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's something your whole family can be involved in. A donor-advised fund can be inherited as part of your estate, and there's resources, there's funds available that your kids and your grandkids can then continue to distribute as your estate guides, or you can even give them the flexibility to use some of that money to donate to the charities and the causes that they feel especially tied to, that really play on their heartstrings. So you can really set a legacy of generosity within your families through donor-advised funds in a way that is relatively simple and straightforward, and is a huge benefit to you from a tax standpoint. And again, even if these numbers might seem a little out there for some people, these are just examples. Your numbers are different. So for some of you, your standard deduction might be a lot lower, and you never know if you might have a situation in life where you have a particularly high income year and you want to do some serious tax planning. It's just good to know what some of these things are, what's available, and how to make them work for you and your lifestyle.
Well, again, in your book, you talk about the fact that you should farm your orchard, and again, you should be a farmer, and again, beginning to think about trees rather than just plants, thinking about long-term instead of short-term. And so these are just some very important principles that will kind of surface out of some of the specifics. So, Chad, I appreciate you making this available. It is free of charge. We have 3 different times and places or dates that you can be a part of it: September 9th, October 15th, and November 6th. You can, again, go to the website, pointofview.net, right-hand column there. You'll see a big V, stands for Veritas webinar registration. Or, of course, you can go to the email we just sent out about a half an hour ago and sign up. And I would encourage you to do so, because a lot of that will happen off air, and we certainly want you to be educated so that you can continue to fund and maybe even maximize your ability to fund the Lord's work. So, Chad, thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate you making it available today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. It's always wonderful to be a part of what you guys are doing, Kerby. So thanks for having me on.
Let me just mention that, again, there are some other great resources that we have made available to you that might encourage you to give. I mentioned just a few minutes ago David Green, the interview I did with Raymond Harris, the interviews we've done with Randy Alcorn, of course, the interviews we've done with Chad Hufford. These are individuals that are encouraging you to take the resources God has placed in your hand and advance the kingdom. And whether you give to a church, whether you give to the radio station that carries this, to missions work, other organizations, or even Point of View, I'll leave that up to you. But if we can help you be more effective and to give even more, what a great opportunity. We're going to take a break, though. We're going to change topics in this second hour. All that coming up right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to those some of those topics, but it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to focus some time and attention on our history, as illustrated by one of the booklets we've just made available, and it is a biblical view on one nation under God. And as we talk about the fact that this nation, as we come to the 250th anniversary since the Declaration of Independence, has some very good things to recommend, but there are also some very dark chapters in American history, and one of those is slavery. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. Might hold up another booklet here, and that is a biblical point of view on the patriot pastors and preachers. We'll mention some of them as we go along here, because we want to focus on this new book, which has the title Ownership: The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. And it is written by Dr. Sean McGever. He has his PhD from the University of Aberdeen. As a matter of fact, his book that came out in 2020, Born Again, The Evangelical Theology Conversion of John Wesley and George Whitefield, is one that ended up as a book, and one that I really would commend to you. We might even have him back sometime to talk about that came out a couple of years ago, Evangelism for the Care of Souls. Sometimes we get so involved when we are actually involved in evangelism about technique that we don't realize we're engaged in soul care. Anyway, he is an individual who also serves as the area director for Young Life in Phoenix, Arizona, and is one of the adjunct faculty at Grand Canyon University, where one of my colleagues actually teaches there as well. So, Dr. McGever, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Kerby. Appreciate it.
Let's, if we can, get right into it, because early on people might say, slavery, what does that have to do with me? And of course, you were speaking at Old South Presbyterian Church there in Massachusetts, and having lived in the Northeast, I'm very well aware of that. Also lived on the West Coast and a number of other places, but when we've traveled up there and even been to some places where Jonathan Edward preached, and in places where George Whitefield was speaking up and down the Atlantic coast, I'm well aware of some of the history, but you've had some people, and probably even some of your students, say, well, why should I care about slavery? That happened in the 18th century, and we Christians were on the right side. Well, not so fast, right?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, why bring up kind of a difficult topic? No one's going to say this is an easy topic to talk about. It's a painful one, so let's just not talk about it. I'll tell you a little bit about my story, why I thought this would be worth for my own investigation, and why I know that readers have found it helpful, which is that, my story is I didn't grow up in the church or anything like that. And when I was a teenager, a youth ministry, Young Life, reached out to me, and by God's grace, my life was changed, and that's wonderful. As I was so excited about the gospel that I received about being born again, about evangelism, about evangelicalism, of which I'm still very much a part of, very active in with Young Life, what we do at Grand Canyon, etc. I was really interested in kind of the type of gospel that I received. Where did this come from? This kind of in the history of the church, and that led me to, go to seminary and do an MDiv, and go to St. Andrews and do a Master of Letters, do my PhD on these great early evangelicals, John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards eventually. And it's like, okay, what is this gospel that I received? And as I looked into it more, and like you mentioned about my earlier book, about being born again and how that concept emerged in the history of the church and for evangelicals, I realized that there was this history with slavery. And I thought, wow, this is really complicated. And after I got through kind of my theological work, systematic theology, historical theology, I wanted to backtrack and look into this historical work. And one of the reasons why I think this is important for myself and perhaps for some of your listeners is I wouldn't want people to get caught in the dark. I mean, this is one of those questions that some folks will kind of like, I gotcha on this one, your Christianity, your beliefs, your evangelicalism, and then they'll kind of do a gotcha. Hey, did you know that there's this background? And so one of the reasons why I think it would be important for us to know about this is so that you're not caught in the dark, that you're prepared to know this history, know some of the ideas with it, because the critics already know about it. This is a common response and criticism of Christianity and different kind of versions of Christianity. So why would we want to care about it? We want to be able to have an answer for these questions, and they're legitimate questions. They're not they're very legitimate ones. So we need to be able to have an answer. I think it is also good to have some idea about modern slavery, trafficking, forced labor, prison labor, to be able to be prepared for some Christian answers and how is it that Christians could engage with that, because there are versions of this that continue. There's also another really interesting thing, which would be the era that we're talking about, and it sounds like you guys are deeply invested in understanding kind of early American history and the roots of that and the religious beliefs and that. But my book kind of takes a snapshot, if you will, roughly like in the year 1700, takes a theological historical snapshot of Christians' attitudes towards slavery, 1700, and then fast forwards 100 years later, in 1800, and says, okay, what were attitudes and approaches to the topic of slavery then? And what we'll find, and what I display in my book, is this radical change that happened in the history of Christianity, where there was a shifting of understanding of what the Bible teaches about the ways Christians should engage this topic. And so it's an extremely dynamic period about the ways that people reassess their evaluation, how they read the Bible, the way that culture, the idea of independence, monarchy, freedom, liberty, all of these important topics that I know that we all care a lot about. This is a century of change when it comes to Christian attitudes about this. And this topic, this difficult topic of slavery, is one that we can now, with the benefit of a couple hundred years of perspective, look at and learn from. So yeah, there's a couple useful reasons why we should dust off this incredibly difficult topic.
Well, you've come to the right place, because one of the things we like to talk about is always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. So that's apologetics. We also like to talk about history. And I might just mention, some of the learning that we've done has come at the hands of an individual that used to be at Baylor, now at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. That's Dr. Thomas Kidd, who is one of many individuals, along with George Marsden and Mark Knoll and a number of others, that have actually endorsed your book. So again, if people are wanting to know more, Ownership, the Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. And just as we come to a break, let me just mention that maybe the wake-up call for some, as you talk about early on, was 5 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been there, decided to remove a statue of George Whitefield. And George Whitefield, we've talked about, was kind of the Billy Graham of the 18th century, if you will. And he was removed because people found out that he was a slave owner, and then it's certainly been the case that oftentimes the argument has always been, if they were engaged in slavery, we shouldn't even pay attention to them, and we started tearing down all sorts of statues. So let's come back and continue our conversation today on this new book. It is published by InterVarsity Press. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about Sean McGever as well as this book, Ownership, the Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield, on our website, pointofview.net. A dark chapter in American history. We need to learn more, and we're going to do so right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
David Brooks writes in the New York Times about America's new segregation. He isn't talking about racial segregation, but instead is focusing on class segregation. Essentially, we're talking about self-segregation. He quotes from the book Diminished Democracy, which observed that Americans used to join cross-class community organizations like the Rotary or the Elks Clubs, but gradually highly educated people left them for professional organizations filled with others more like themselves. Dan McLaughlin agrees with David Brooks, but then adds another important reason. First, he agrees with him and points to the veterans of foreign wars, which crossed class lines because military service was a common experience. But that began to change during the Vietnam War, when college deferments meant that college-going young men could avoid the draft. Second, Dan McLaughlin points to another reason Brooks did not mention: ideology. He says progressive lawsuits, pressure campaigns, and marches through the institutions had a lot to do with killing cross-class institutions, especially those that once served men. The Boy Scouts are Exhibit A of this dynamic. Dads and sons camping in the woods and learning knots and archery and the like was once an activity where it didn't matter if your dad was a surgeon or a bricklayer. When the Boy Scouts were formed, they represented so much of what was good about America. Less than a century later, they went from being one of the most admired groups to one of the most vilified groups. Our polarized political world is due to many factors, but an important one is self-segregation that is taking place in society. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Slavery is our topic today as we talk about the evangelical legacy of slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. And we're talking with Dr. Sean McGever, and the book is entitled Ownership. And just before we get into them being the men of their times, I'm going to be in Savannah, Georgia next week. And, of course, we have listeners there and all over Georgia as well as all over the country. And one of the things you took the time to do was go to the African American Culture Center in Savannah. And what you found was kind of interesting because in some respects, what you found is white folks, as you said, were really embarrassed about a conversation about slavery, and black folks were worn out by it. And yet here we are doing a program on that, and you've written a book on it. But in some respects, there's a need to begin to clarify and to be honest about our history. And that's why I appreciate your book so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the time that I spent there in Savannah was eye-opening. The primary reason I went there was because one of the people that we might discuss in my books about, George Whitefield, started an orphanage there, and it still has a legacy that's going on there. So it was, they're kind to host me, and I spent time with them. But then, I was there at the Beach Institute in Savannah and talked with the director at length, and had other conversations that, I understand. People didn't want to talk about it. That didn't surprise me. But I think the point of history is what we can learn from it, and that we can be prepared, especially those of us that are passionate about evangelism, the gospel. We need to be able to be prepared, like we mentioned in the last segment, to have a hope for which we have.
Well, let's, if we can, talk about men of their times. And of course, you use one quote from Dr. Henry Louis Gates at Harvard. But whether it's him or a variety of others, whether we're talking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, whether we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, whether we're talking about George Whitefield, whether we're talking about Jonathan Edwards, there is a sense in which, and you do a very good job early on in the book, helping us understand that slavery was there for a long time. People were born into a belief that slavery was pretty much routine. And we sometimes today in our 21st century world say, how is it that Christians could miss that this idea of buying and selling individuals was immoral and unjustified and maybe unbiblical, and that I think helps us understand some of the influences that are the first part of your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no one can control the society, the time, place, location that you're born into. That's nothing that we need to make an excuse for or try to explain away. It just is what it is. You have no control over that. And in fact, to go further, from a Christian's perspective, we also should expect, because of original sin and the prevalence of sin in the world, that there's going to be things wrong with our culture. There's going to be things that need to be corrected about beliefs and attitudes. So no one's immune from this. And also, I mean, while we are, doctrine of original sin is important, we have no control over if I was born in 1700s America, or I was born today, or I was born in the biblical era, or what have you. And so more of it is recognizing the situation that you're born into. And really, that's kind of a parallel conversation of almost like an age of accountability. There becomes a crossover point where you have no control over where you're at and what you're born into once you start to recognize for yourself the things that you are now making active choices about, the activities, ideologies that you are perpetuating, forwarding, affirming as your own responsibility. And so once our eyes are open to that, it's definitely a different situation.
Well, again, I think it's helpful that early on in the book you explain how some Christians made their peace with it, that slavery was ordained by God, or slavery is a result of sin, or acquiring slaves maybe should be done within limits. They would then quote a verse out of context that slaves must obey their masters and those kinds of things. So there was a fair amount of teaching. Let's give credit where credit is due. There were quite a number of Christians that were abolitionists and wanted to end the slave trade and wanted to ban slavery. But how is it that some individuals who call themselves Christians, read the Bible, came to a conclusion that slavery is just something that we should take for granted? Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sad truth of the matter is that prior to about the year 1700, Christians who were in power affirmed the institution of slavery. When they read the Bible, they saw it as a manual about how to regulate the institution of slavery rather than questioning the institution itself. And that's a really important point of distinction that my book sets forth in the very beginning, and that often is overlooked. The difference between the institution of slavery and the management of slavery. And up until about the year 1700, most Christians in power, or almost without any exceptions, they saw the Bible about how to manage the institution of slavery in a biblical way, and hopefully in a loving, et cetera, kind of way. But they saw it as a management manual rather than questioning the institution itself. And that's the thing about the 18th century that is really important, which is that people started to question if even the Bible taught that the institution itself was taught, and that we should affirm that. So that was a major turning point. There's really very few, if any, instances in church history where people questioned the institution until about the year 1700. And this is around the world, not just America, around the world. And I cataloged that in that chapter, in the third chapter, about attitudes towards slavery. by Christians in the year 1700. Those are pretty. That was essentially what they were.
It was part of the culture. I don't quote Bill Maher every day here on Point of View, but a while back he was saying something about slavery, and he said, "Look, don't sit here and argue that you would never have been a slaveholder. You would never have allowed slavery to exist. If you'd lived in that time, you might have yourself." And a little bit later, when we talk about this, I'm going to talk about things that we certainly turn a blind eye to today in the 21st century. But just maybe before we take a break, talk for just a couple minutes about that chapter on participation, because yes, we had slavery that existed since really we read about that even in the Old Testament, for example. But how did these people participate? And it turns out that whether you look at John Wesley or Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield, they were. Now, to be fair, Wesley more just had a, as you call it, 37-year silence about this, but help us out with those three individuals, because that helps us understand the issue that you really have as kind of the center part of your book.
Yeah. One of the really fascinating things about the history of these three individuals is that John Wesley, who's the founder of Methodism, and some people recognize his name, and Jonathan Edwards, which some other listeners will know, John Piper and others had brought him a lot of attention. John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards were born in the same year, about 100 days apart.
Yes.
But they were born in two places, across the Atlantic. And I would imagine that if their lives had been switched and they had been born, maybe in each other's shoes, if you will, they would have had the same exact beliefs just because of their context. And the important part would be that Jonathan Edwards was born into a strong Christian house that also enslaved Africans. So from the earliest memories that Jonathan Edwards had, his family had enslaved people, and he was used to that. And Jonathan Edwards, from the beginning of his memories until the day he died, participated in that. On the other side of the Atlantic, born in the exact same year, a Christian with just as much of a commitment to the gospel, etc., John Wesley, did not grow up in a context where enslaving people in your house, etc., was a norm. And so he did not participate in that. He encountered that in his missionary work when he went to Georgia and he went to Savannah, and then up into South Carolina as well briefly. But then it was very familiar. It was excited to actually evangelize those that are enslaved. But went back to England, knew firsthand about the atrocities and the difficulties of slavery, but didn't really do anything about it for about 37 years. And we could talk about that later era. But their participation was largely based on their context. Jonathan Edwards being in colonial America, John Wesley being in England, what they grew up with and what they saw, and then what they continued with. George Whitefield is the really interesting one because he goes back 13 times transatlantic travels.
Right.
And he basically has a foot in both countries.
Yes,
and so he's the dynamic figure where he kind of has John Wesley's origins, where this is not a norm. But then he spends just so much time in America that he becomes an enslaver, not unlike Jonathan Edwards.
Very
and
good.
so he is the transitory kind of person that we can really take a close look at his life about how he interacts with both cultures.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about, first of all, action against slavery. And, of course, let's give credit to the Quakers, but also might even mention certainly William Wilberforce in England and a few other things. And then we'll get into how to kind of think through this difficult issue. And we'll be back right after this.
Picture someone in your life, if you can, who needs the truth. Have you ever wished that you could point that person to resources that would help them? Maybe they're buying into mainstream media lies, and you wish you could easily share information providing a more full picture. Or maybe they're questioning their faith. They need devotionals and testimonies, resources they identify with. Maybe they're navigating parenting in this modern era. They need insight on handling new technology and mental health crises and everything in between. When you support Point of View, you provide resources just like these to people who need the truth. The best way to support Point of View is by joining the Truth Team. I invite you to learn more about the Truth Team by visiting us online at pointofview.net Or you can learn by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. The Truth Team, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again
is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about ownership, the evangelical legacy of slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. Dr. Sean McGever with us. And one of the things you say early on in the book, but it's relevant to what you just said a few minutes ago before we took the break, the great-grandparents of Wesley, Whitefield, and Edwards did not enslave people. The primary question that determined whether their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would enslave people is this: which side of the Atlantic did they live on? Our historical and geographical locateness profoundly influences our decision-making, including our Christian decision-making. And so in some respects, people say, well, how could they accept that? Well, it was more acceptable in America than it was in England. Of course, George Whitefield was in both of those. But one very quick mention I think is worthwhile, and that is action against slavery. And one of those unlikely voices, you say, are the Quakers. And so even at the time, you had not just the Quakers, but then later on, of course, Wesley himself speaking out against slavery. So let's give credit where credit is due. We ended up having an abolition movement, didn't we?
Absolutely, yeah. And it starts, like you just introduced, in an unlikely place. The Quakers were founded by a guy named George Fox around 1650. He had a vision, and it led to a focus on the inner light that is inside of every person. It kind of might be similar to how Christians might imagine that the Holy Spirit might speak to every person, something kind of parallel to that. And as the Quakers developed and grew, they really prioritized kind of the leading of this inner light, or perhaps of the Holy Spirit. And with that, in kind of their original ethos, kind of their foundational view on the way that they believe that God interacted with people, that really stabilized and equalized all people. God could speak to men, God could speak to women, God could speak to masters, God could speak to slaves, etc. And so because of that, they had a view for a radical equality of all people that was unusual in their era. And so that developed, started in 1650, and about 100 years into that, 1750, 1760, as they're seeing, especially in America, they're coming because they're persecuted for their beliefs. In England, they, like others, flee England and head over to the colonies, and are starting to thrive in Pennsylvania, William Penn, that area and others.
Yes.
They take, and then they're also saying, wow, this slavery, the treatment of Black people, the treatment of lessers in society, and they start speaking up about it. So they become extremely active once they, kind of get the roots there in 1750, 1760, and there's this key figure among the Quakers named Anthony Benezet, and he starts documenting some of the atrocities that are happening. And his real kind of priority, or where this is coming from, is because he believes in the radical equality of all people. And he brings this out, and it's being documented. People are shocked. And so in 1772, Wesley ends up reading the most prominent document that comes out, and he is absolutely shocked by what he's reading, and he remembers back to decades earlier when he was in South Carolina, and he had seen some of this himself, and he felt like he couldn't just stay silent anymore.
And so again, as you even point out, as he concluded his eulogy for George Whitefield and stepped down from that chapel, he's thinking about the fact that Whitefield, of course, had led so many people to the Lord, had such a great influence, and even had an orphanage, but the orphanage operated on the backs of slave labor. So now he sort of has, as you say, his own eulogy because of all those, well, at least 2 or 3 decades worth of silence, now begins to speak out.
Yeah, that's right. So this is, like I said, it's just a dynamic time. I mean, the 1770s, obviously we had 1776, the American, but also for this, Wesley speaks at his good friend George Whitefield's, his funeral. Whitefield had requested that he would. And, it's not the right place at a eulogy or funeral to maybe bring up the, deficiencies of a person. But Wesley was very familiar with what was happening at Whitefield's orphanage, which was funded by slavery. And Whitefield actually helped advocate for Georgia to flip from the only colony that in which slavery was illegal. Whitefield had helped push Parliament to be able to flip it so that slavery was legal. So Whitefield was deeply entrenched in a pro-slavery movement and participation in that. So Wesley knew about that, but then, he comes into contact with this Quaker writing, and I feel like something had been bubbling up in him. And in kind of the ethos of that era, where I think there's a better way forward. And he, in 1772, reads the works of these Quakers, who were an unusual group. They were kind of not the most orthodox group. They didn't prioritize the Trinity and how they had their services and such. Christians were skeptical about kind of whether or not these folks were Christian. Wesley had his questions too, but he still listened to them. And 1772 reads them. And in 1774, Wesley writes his kind of pivotal document, Thoughts Upon Slavery, which is where he says, I need to speak up. I need to say this is wrong.
Well, and again, that gets us back to one of the things that you have later in your book, and that is the legacy. The legacy of Jonathan Edwards was, of course, that he disapproved of the slave trade, but he still enslaved individuals, Africans, and promoted slavery as an institution. With George Whitefield, we've already sort of buried him in one sense, and did not leave a family behind, nor did he really leave a movement behind. But with the John Wesley, we have everything, because now he is talking and speaking to this issue. He's writing to William Wilberforce. He's writing about this. As a matter of fact, you never want to trace too far back your family lineage, but my father did one time and find out that a good number of my ancestors were Methodist circuit riders and abolitionists, which was good to hear,
well, that's
because of Methodism. And now that, of course, gets us into the second great revival, Great Awakening, which we won't get into today. But you can see some of the legacy that continued on because of a decision made by John Wesley, can't you?
Yes, yeah. It ends up being a bit of a mixed reception, but yeah, there's absolute good. Famously, the last letter that Whitefield writes right before he dies is to William Wilberforce, saying, keep up the fight, do not give up.
Right.
So, I mean, really, that's Wesley's parting words in his life, and we're so thankful for William Wilberforce and everything that he did. So, Wesley, in the last 8 years of his life, is very vocal and such a great trend. What happens is the Methodist movement is growing massively in America. In the 1800s, it becomes the largest denomination in America. So it's
right.
The loudest voice in America during that era. And the challenge is, just like the Civil War and stuff, people are divided for a variety of reasons on where they fall on this. And so the legacy of Methodism has good and bad parts to it. Where you could have like yourself, have a legacy that goes back to Methodist abolitionism. That's wonderful. Or it could be on the other side where maybe enslavers. So, like for instance, Frederick Douglass, who a lot of people have heard of. His enslaver was not a Christian.
Yeah.
Yes, and his enslaver goes to a Methodist revival, becomes a Christian. And Frederick Douglass says he became an even more despotic, cruel enslaver because he felt like his slavery and his treatment of the slave was of Frederick Douglass was now supported by the Bible, and so actually became a more cruel man. But then, what's fascinating, a lot of people don't read to the end of Frederick Douglass's narrative. He strikes a big difference. You would think that someone like him would say, "Well, then I'm just going to reject Christianity and all this." But instead, he doesn't. Frederick Douglass says, no, there is a vast difference between the Christianity of the slaveholder, of the master, and the Christianity of Christ. And I mean, that's just such a powerful witness to the gospel of Christ and to the message of Christ, as opposed to when we notice that there's obvious sin, there's personal gain, and we just need to be very aware of when we compromise the true gospel and grace of Christ and the equality of all people that he wants us to communicate to all people.
Yeah, in his appendix, you have this quote here where, again, Frederick Douglass says, what I've said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion, for between Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. And, of course, he praises the black Methodist churches and a number of other things that are part of that. When we come back, I thought since we've talked about most of it, you have a section on ownership today. Can we own up to the failures of our heroes? And maybe are we, if we're not careful, blind to some of the abuses today that we certainly would be held accountable about in the future, just as sometimes we want to hold those people in the 18th century accountable for some of their blindsided ideas and maybe tunnel vision. So we'll come back and talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, the book is entitled Ownership, The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery. Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. Dr. Sean McGever with us, and you start this section by talking about the fact that, well, you and your fiance were engaged, and now it's time to tell the whole story, the good and the bad. And, of course, you can't just discard the parts you dislike and keep the parts you enjoy because, you know, that's marriage. When we get into our heroes, when we get into the issue of the slave history in America. It's not just the good and the bad, it's the good and the bad and the ugly. And it seems to me, and I'll see if you agree or not, but I'm going to step out on a limb and say that some of the criticism that I've seen about many of these people in the 18th century engages in what might be called chronological snobbery. You know, C.S. Lewis talks about that.
Right.
Well, I'm in the 21st century. There's just no possible way that I would countenance slavery. Well, you're not a man of the times. You were not involved there. I'm not excusing it, but I am trying to understand. And there are people that sometimes will say, you know, how can we even allow the statue of George Whitefield to exist? Yes, he did all sorts of good, and he created an orphanage and led all sorts of people to the Lord, but he also had slaves. And you see this with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. You see this even with some of the statements that Lincoln has made. And I think that does engage in, I think, chronological snobbery. But what's your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, the challenge is that we are expecting perfection from humans that aren't Jesus. You know, every person has failures. And so we should just own them. We should not expect anyone other than Christ to be perfect. And so we should always be in the position that God is gracious enough to do good and true things through any person, and that can reflect God. At the same time, those people other than Christ are always going to be people who carry with them and participate in sin. And so there should be a freedom that we don't expect too much from them. Just like when I look in the mirror and I look at myself, as much as I want to be perfect, one of the bases of my faith is to confess my sins and to thank God that He knows and accepts me as I am. I don't claim to be a perfect person. I don't want anyone to remember me or to try to remember me as a perfect person. That's just not truthful. However, if God in His graciousness has been able to do good and true and beautiful things through me, all praise be to God. And so when we look back at these people in American history, Christian history, we need to have a similar posture that we might have for ourselves or someone else that we know really well, where we go, there's good and there's bad. And it's okay. And we can have a person that who enslaved someone and say, we 100% reject that. And a difference between the word and but is important there. And recognize that God used them in powerful ways. And that's not to their own credit. It was because the grace of God worked through them. And so that distinction of rather than a but instead of saying an and is so important, because that is the dichotomy that every human other than Christ lives in.
One of the other things I might mention is that if you are convinced that you would, in the 18th century, have fought against slavery, you would have been part of the abolition movement, and maybe some would, what goes on today that you should be involved in? And lots of times people say, well, we don't have slavery today. Well, you look around the world, there is slavery in some parts of the world, and there is certainly slave labor. Let me hold up this book for just a minute. Check Your Financial Privilege. Alex Gladstone reminds us that most of us are walking around with clothes, with shoes, maybe with cell phones that were actually manufactured through slave labor of some sort. And so if you are really convinced that you would be involved in trying to right the evils of slavery in the 18th century, how about getting involved today in some of those actions? And whether it's standing for life and preventing abortion, whether it's standing for justice in many of these third world countries, there's just a lot to do. And in some respects, your final chapter reminds us that if we really want to own the idea that these were flawed individuals that made mistakes, and really would hope that all of them would leave a legacy, as eventually John Wesley did, what can we do today to maybe right some of the wrongs that we see around us?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, I coach high school basketball. I like Nike shoes. All the high school guys around, they like Nike. And as I was writing this book, I thought, I'm not so sure that these shoes that I love were produced in ethical ways that are consistent with what I do. There's choices that we make about, definitely like your checkbook. That's an excellent example. Are we, promoting and using the resources that God has given us to be able to try to promote things, whether it be the shoes or in our community? I don't, I guess I could choose different shoes, but there are plenty of things in my community that I can be active with my time, my possessions, my privilege, those sort of things. Like for myself, one of the places I have the most sphere of influence. So a question that I ask people when we talk about this is, what spheres of influence do you have? And obviously our checkbook, everyone has that. My influence, because I work for an evangelical ministry, is in evangelism. And so there is a temptation with evangelicals, and I've written a lot about evangelical conversion, and I'm an evangelist. I love evangelizing, very passionate about it. At the same time, I want to be very careful that I don't do so in a way that is a power trip, where as if I'm God holding over you your salvation. The offer of the gospel is a response that a person has between them and God, and it's their relationship with God. It could be very easy in my sphere of influence as an evangelist to try to manipulate conversations and things like that, where I could try to use power, sophisticated reasoning, etc. And while God might use some of those dynamics in his mercy, I need to be very mindful. Like, for instance, at my desk here, where I'm working and speaking right now, I have the receipt of George Whitfield's inventory of his belongings after he died, his belongings and the prices. And I have from the Georgia Archives the receipt that has things like how many cows he owned and how many shovels he owned. And sadly, and it's awful, the names of all of the people that when he died that he enslaved and their value. And the reason I have such a terrible document in front of me is to remind me as an evangelist to be very mindful about not dehumanizing any person that I'm in front of, and to try to use a power move as an evangelist, as a Christian, and instead to communicate with no strings attached the good, free offer of the gospel, and to leave the results to God. So I think it's just a question about our spheres of influence, our resources that we have, and where we can speak up for God being God and not us being God.
Let me just mention this before I let you go, that we do have a link to Young Life and the particular organization that you are involved with. We also, of course, have your Facebook link there as well, and people would want to contact you, maybe have you come and speak to this issue. And certainly, I certainly have just high regard for Young Life. We've had a number of other speakers with Young Life. It was influential in my own conversion as well, and it's just great that we could have you on the program today. And thank you for the time that you spent in first writing this book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. I really appreciate it.
Again, the book is entitled Ownership, The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. It is one of the dark chapters in American history. We need to tell all of the story as well. And Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, George Whitefield were the world's three most prominent evangelicals at that time. All three were deeply compromised when you come to the issue of slavery, and that's why we thought it would be worth talking about today. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Again, you can find out more about this on our website, pointofview.net, and you've been listening to Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.